Hi everybody, my name is Chris Collison and we're about to embark on Lecture 2 of the writing course CHEM 670, and today we're going to talk more about characters and actions, that is subjects and our choice of verbs, and how we can write clearly, more concisely and in a compelling way. That's our general goal for the rest of the semester. And we'll also talk today about the 8-word test. So let's start and take a look at some better use of subjects and verbs in sentences. So let's take a look first of all at what we accomplished in week 1. Let's remember that our course goal was to communicate our science effectively, and another outcome of the semester will be to have written 5,000 words for the introduction to your thesis or for your formal research project report. Another thing that I brought up was the importance of critical thinking and interpretation and context. That's particularly important for communication. We talked about single data points and rolling those data points up into something that could actually allow us to make a better decision in our lives. We also talked about the value of scientific work and the importance of intellectual merit and broad impact. We looked at papers. We said we've got to read them. We need to know where to find those papers in the literature. We need to be able to review them. That's how we're going to learn. And then we also need to watch how those papers have been written by others and use those approaches as templates for our own effective writing. And lastly, we did some summaries. We reviewed some summaries, and I pointed out that I think we can all recognize high quality writing when we see it. We can pick between good writing and bad writing. I also talked about how we need more than just a statement of go improve your writing. We need to actually think about the tools and the language that we can use in order to help each other improve our writing, and indeed how we learn from critiquing. So that was a review of week 1. What are we going to cover in this shorter lecture in week 2? We're going to continue thinking about characters, and we need to be able to write with perceptible, consistent, and important subjects. These subjects need to continue to flow through a paragraph, so we're going to ultimately start to think about repetition of these main characters and repetition of a central theme. We're also going to look at actions, the importance of putting our verbs in very specific actions. And we're also going to talk today about something called the 8-word test, which is a way in which you can look at your own writing and say, do I need to do more work on this prose? So let's move on. And we'll remind ourselves about characters and subjects. You'll remember that we discussed a character table where there's a higher on the character scale means that a reader is going to be able to understand our characters more effectively. In general, though, we want to keep whole subjects short. Well, what's a whole subject? We'll talk about that in a minute. We want to make sure those subjects are high on the character scale. The character scale I put forward in last week's lecture. We want to make sure simple subjects are concrete characters. Well, what's a simple subject? Again, we'll look at that shortly. We also want to avoid putting nominalizations into the subject position of our sentences. So a nominalization is a noun that's created from a verb. It may also be created from an adjective, but importantly here we're going to think about nominalizations as being created from verbs as those subjects. So some examples would be, well, interference is a noun. It could be used in the subject position of the sentence, but it's actually a nominalization of the verb to interfere. Similarly, decision is a nominalization of the verb to decide. We might also say a person argues, but the nominalization of the verb argue would be argument. So it's important that we put actions in our verbs, not in nominalizations. This helps us twofold. First of all, it means we are less likely to have an abstract subject in our sentence, but more importantly, we put the actions that are important in our communication, we put those in the verb position in the sentence. So I said I'd give you some examples of simple subject and whole subject. Well, the simple subject is simply the fewest words as that subject with the sentence still making sense. The whole subject, on the other hand, consists of that simple subject, plus it includes the other describing words, perhaps all the other words in that subject, usually running up to the verb. So let's have a look at an example here. So the tall and slender man who had earlier been slouched in front of the television firmly shook my hand. In this particular case, the man here is bolded. In principle, we could rewrite this whole sentence by saying the man firmly shook my hand. So the man would be the simple subject. The whole subject here contains all that other stuff. So we might say the tall and slender man. So the tall and slender are adjectives describing that man. We also have some additional description here. We recognize that the man had earlier been slouched in front of the television. So we could state that the whole subject was indeed simply the tall and slender man who had earlier been slouched in front of the television. So when these whole subjects become really long, readers are going to struggle. So one general idea for subjects: keep them short, keep them concrete. Don't put abstract nouns in there, don't put nominalizations in there, and remember the character scale. Let's talk about actions for a second. So actions, really verbs here, but actions are anything that's happening in your story. Remember, when you're communicating, actually most of the time you will be communicating in the form of a story. So an action might refer to an idea in science or a relationship between ideas. It may be a causal relationship. This happens because of X, Y, Z. It does not have to always refer to some physical activity. So the action does not have to actually be a physical activity. I want you to stop. When you look at your work, when you look at your writing, this is a point where you need to practice some critical thinking. What actions are the most important in your narrative? What questions can you ask yourself to find the appropriate action to put in to the most powerful verb and the most powerful sentence? So first of all, review all your drafts. You're going to write a draft, you're going to have a stream of consciousness, you're going to put stuff down on the page. That's important to do, but it's also important to refine your writing. So you must proofread that work. So when you're reviewing text and you're revising, think about these questions. What action is most closely connected to the main character? And again, it's the character that's the main subject here. It's going to be the theme of the paragraph. So what action is most closely connected to that character? What is the character doing? Or what is being done to the character? When you can identify what the character is doing or what is being done to the character, that is most likely going to be the key action that's most important in your narrative. So make that action the verb. So let's look at some examples. We have a sentence in the top panel that says the decision of the group was about which lab would be easier to do first. So let's think about what the subject is. And the easiest subject to think about here is the group. So then we ask ourselves what action relates to the subject, and it's actually, when we think about this, it's the decision. So it's the group making a decision, and we can see that this is actually already in a nominalization. So the idea to decide is embedded in this nominalization here with the word decision. So how do we change things around? Well, we simply rewrite this. The group decided to do an easier lab first. So the key here, it's simpler to read, there are fewer words, and this works. It's clearer, it's more concise, and in principle, when we embed this with the rest of a paragraph, it will be more compelling. Let's look at a second example. She made the conclusion that the data were inaccurate. Again, what's the subject? It's easier to say that the subject here is she. What action relates to the subject? Well, it's clearly the verb to conclude. We're actually making a conclusion. We're embedding the verb in a nominalization here. So we can simplify here again and make the verb clearer, make the action clearer by simply saying she concluded that the data were inaccurate. Again, simpler to read and fewer words. And again, what's this 8-word test? Well, this is how we use this 8-word test, at least. Go to the beginning of each sentence in your paragraph. Underline the beginning of that sentence until you either reach a verb or have underlined 8 words, whichever comes first. If the verb is the 9th word, underline that also. You're going to ignore introductory phrases like in comparison to XYZ or for the most part. These are adverbs that start sentences that connect with prior sentences. So we're going to put those to one side and not include them in the 8-word test. The point here is when you look at the underlined words, you can know that your writing will be clear when in those first 8 words you see a short, specific subject followed by a verb expressing a specific action. Of course, if you don't see this, if you fail the test, then you've got to work harder until you pass the 8-word test. So we won't look at examples here. This is better off for you to actually look at your work writing, look at those sentences, learn to recognize subjects, whole subjects, simple subjects, learn to recognize verbs, and practice this 8-word test because it's a good tool that lets you know that your audience appreciates what you're trying to say. Your audience understands what you're saying and your writing is clear. So let's pick these apart finally. Let's look at these 2 sentences. I'm going to leave you with these sentences. Are they easy or difficult to read? Try the 8-word test for practice in your own work. We've seen this one already. The tall and slender man who had earlier been slouched in front of the television firmly shook my hand. Does that pass the 8-word test? Certainly the second one I don't think passes the 8-word test. There's a lot of fluff early on. Is this some connecting sentences that we should move aside? But it's very difficult to read, and the important thing here is that we have to, if we want to be good writers, think about our audience, and that's what we'll talk about in the next lecture. So, subjects and actions are important. I'm going to put it to you that most of the time the problems with communication stem from lack of cohesion in blocks of sentences, in blocks of paragraphs. So we're going to explore that fully as we move forward in the next few weeks. But as I mentioned a few seconds ago, we're now going to consider our readership. We're going to consider our audience and how we need to get something typically from that audience. And in order to get something from the audience, we need to be writing in a compelling way. Thanks for listening.